Last Sunday, we looked at Luke's Sermon on the Plain. It is in many ways very similar to what we know perhaps more readily as the Sermon on the Mount. They are both sermons that record the words of Jesus. Luke's take is a little different than Matthew's take, but nevertheless, they are essentially the same. And last Sunday, we talked about the great reversal that Jesus speaks of in Luke chapter 6. We looked at verses 17 through 26. This morning, we're going to look at Luke chapter 6, verses 27 through 36. So if you have your Bibles, you might open it up, and we will get to it in just a moment. I want to begin by talking about a time when I was simply driving. One of my favorite things to do when I'm in any town or city, as I drive in neighborhoods and down streets that I do not necessarily know, looking for churches just to see. And I'm always been fascinated by church signs, as many of you know. Several years ago, I happened to be driving past a church sign in a different city, in which I read the title of the sermon for that upcoming Sunday. And there in big letters, posted on the sign, was the title of that Sunday's sermon, which simply was entitled, "Following Jesus is Loving and Practical." I almost wrecked. But then I began to think to myself, as I often do when I read something, I began to argue with myself about that sign. In fact, with nobody else in the car, talking only to myself, I couldn't help but say, I don't think so. Following Jesus may be loving, but it's not very practical. And I immediately began to make a mental list, as I often do, of all the ways in which following Jesus, well, yes, loving, wasn't simply practical. And as I was making the mental list, I arrived at my destination, and so I ceased at that point, went about doing whatever it was that I needed to do in finishing that argument. And I have found myself wondering from time to time exactly what it was that the pastor said on that Sunday morning. I also decided that should I ever make the decision to take up the argument that I was having with myself regarding that sign, I would turn to today's gospel reading. Luke chapter 6, beginning in verse 27. Jesus continues this Sermon on the Plain by simply saying, "But to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, because He is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful." In rereading that text again this week, I found myself returning to the argument that I was having about being practical in following Jesus. And I really wanted to say, Really, Jesus? Really? I mean, Jesus, can we not be a little bit more realistic? Because you see, Jesus, if someone takes away all of my goods, then how on earth am I going to be able to give to those who are begging from me? It's nonsense. Simply doesn't make any sense. And then I remembered his words in the text that simply said, do to others as you would have them do to you. And I thought to myself, well, that's a lot better, at least. Sounds a lot more practical. Kind of sounds like something you might find on a poster in a school hallway or a corporate conference room. Those framed, beautiful colored pictures. People of all races working together, or children from around the world holding hands in some big circle with the picture, and over that picture are the words, do to others as you'd have them do to you. That makes sense. I mean, we tend to know those words as what? The golden rule. Okay? They're not unique to Jesus. In fact, those words are found not only in Matthew and Luke, but also in the writings of Homer and the writings of Seneca. This is the kind of wisdom that we learned in kindergarten, when the teacher told us to, what? Treat other people the way you wanted to be treated. Now, sometimes it is tempting to boil the whole Bible down to one verse like that. Why? Because it's a verse people can understand. Okay? And it sounds like practical wisdom about simply getting along in the world. But here's the thing, it's not possible to boil the entire Bible down to one verse, even as good as that verse might be. Because if we pull the golden rule out of this chapter as a summary of everything that Jesus said, it's likely we're going to miss most of what Jesus said. You have to go back to where Jesus began. And what words did he begin with? Love your enemies. And he says it not once. He repeats it a few verses later. But love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. You see, the result of the golden rule is that it applies even when we sense that someone's not going to treat us the way we would like to be treated. That's precisely where it gets extremely difficult. Because that kind of behavior may not only be impractical, it might also be downright dangerous. Love your enemies. Do good to them. Lend, expecting nothing in return. And then Jesus has the audacity to go on and share words about turning the other cheek and giving up your shirt along with your coat. Those are words that seem very demeaning in the extreme. What we have to bear in mind is that it's likely when Jesus is speaking here, he's speaking to those who are victims, not the victimizers. He's speaking to those who are oppressed rather than their oppressors. Jesus isn't calling for you and I to simply roll over and play dead. And yet it's very hard for us to see that. Because it sounds like Jesus is telling the victim, simply just be quiet. Don't say a word, just keep taking it. New Testament scholar by the name of Dr. Walter Wink, along with others, has attempted to help us see something far different. He works primarily with Matthew's version of the story, but the same insights, I think, could also be applied to Jesus' words here in the Gospel of Luke. Strange as it may seem, Wink and other New Testament scholars see Jesus' words as a form of nonviolent resistance to oppression. Now, this is a little tricky because we have to know something about the culture in which Jesus lived. And here's what we have to understand. In the culture of first century Palestine, you would never strike a person with your left hand. Okay? You just didn't do that sort of thing. You would never ever strike a person with your left hand. If you were superior to the other person, you would simply strike them with the back of your right hand. Okay? Never with the palm of your hand, for that would mean you see them as an equal. So this is the picture that Jesus is painting for his listeners. If someone strikes you on the cheek, it's most likely going to be with the back of their hand, because remember, Jesus is talking to victims, and the oppressor is not going to be seeing you as an equal. He's likely to hit you with the back of his hand. And when he hits you, if you turn your face to the side, you force your oppressor to see you as an equal. For even your oppressor is not about to use his left hand. Some things simply were not done. So he has struck you with the back of his hand, and as he begins to swing again, he finally stops himself in midair because he recognizes that if he strikes you again, it's with the palm of his hand, and he doesn't want to treat you as an equal. Okay? Someone strikes you on the cheek, Jesus said, you turn the other cheek. Let him make the decision if he wants to treat you as an equal or not. And the same resistance comes in giving up your shirt when your oppressor asks for your coat. He's talking about something completely different here. It's likely that someone is asking you for your coat. Why? As a repayment for a debt. You owe the oppressor something, and since you have no land, you have very little money, what do? Your oppressor asks you for your coat. Now, there were some very strict restrictions regarding the repayment of debt. You could not leave the person who owed you debt. You could not leave them without any clothes at sundown, no matter what he or she might have owed. Okay? Simply wasn't to be done. It was simply another one of those things that just wasn't done. Okay? It was against every ounce of decency and good order. So Jesus sets up another strategy of resistance. Jesus says, if they ask for your coat, give them your shirt too. What does that mean? What that means is you're going to be standing there half naked before them. Okay? And they'll be forced now to deal with the new reality you've set. Okay? It's no longer about them, it's about you. The point I'm trying to make is Jesus was telling his listeners not to remain victims, but to find new ways of resisting evil. Love your enemies, Jesus said. Do good to those who hate you, Jesus said. It's the very same ethic that moved Martin Luther King Jr. to kneel down with hundreds of men and women before water hoses and snarling dogs. There were those who looked at him and said, man, you're crazy. Only violence can fight violence. The problem was the authorities and the oppressors didn't know what to do with that kind of resistance. The oppressors knew the power of violence. They knew the powerlessness of victims who knew their place. But what Martin Luther King Jr. and those hundreds of people did, that was something entirely new to those oppressors. They had not seen that before. Victims who refused to be victims. Victims who refused to fight back with violence. Victims who were going to claim their place and reshape the battle completely? Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. And then Jesus just goes on to kind of twist the knife a little more. He says, and don't be too impressed with yourself for being good to your friends. Jesus says anybody can do that. He says, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. Further, he says, if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And furthermore, if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive that which they have lent. It's amazing. Just when we think we have the golden rule memorized, Jesus reminds us that it's far deeper than how we treat our friends. Jesus reminds us that it's far deeper than what we hope to receive. It's even different from treating others the way we hope to be treated. Because Jesus comes to the place where he began when he says, but love your enemies, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Listen, it's not very practical. Especially, it's not practical in the sense of trying to get ahead in the world. It's certainly not very practical when it's simply about doing what comes very naturally to us. I've said it time and time again. The kingdom of God ethic is a very difficult ethic. And for those who think that it's somehow less difficult to follow Jesus, think again. Think again. Because so much of Jesus' teachings and so much of kingdom ethic goes against the very nature of who we are as human beings. It just happens. As I read and reread these words from Jesus this past week, I couldn't help but think about the mother of Matthew Shepard. Anybody in here remember who Matthew Shepard was? I see a few hands going up. Matthew Wayne Shepard was a student at the University of Wyoming who was beaten, tortured, and left to die near Laramie, Wyoming on October the 6th, 1998. He was transported by rescuers to a hospital in Fort Collins, Colorado, where he died 6 days later from severe head injuries sustained during the attack. You know why he was attacked? He was brutally beaten for being gay. Beaten because one man felt that he had somehow made a pass at him, and that made that man feel foolish and somehow unmanly. And so he got a friend to help him put this young college student in his place. The two beat Matthew Shepard over and over and over again. And then they tied him to a fence on a country road and made the decision to leave him alone in a freezing night. By the time someone found him tied to the fence the next morning, by the time they got him to the hospital, there was absolutely no way to save him. Matthew Shepard died in that hospital in Fort Collins, Colorado, while literally hundreds of people held a candlelight vigil outside the hospital. Now, the two men who killed Matthew Shepard, well, they were arrested, they were tried, and they were convicted of brutal hate crimes. Having been proved in the first degree murder, they deserved the death penalty in the state of Wyoming. That would have been the end of their lives. But Matthew Shepard's mother came before the judge, and she asked the judge to spare the lives of those two men who had been found guilty for literally beating and torturing and leaving her son for dead. Let me repeat that. She asked the judge to spare their lives. I'm not sure there are many who could understand what she'd gone through in all those agonizing months leading up to the trial. I found myself asking the question, what mother could possibly sleep with images of her beloved son tied to a fence, beaten and alone through the night of freezing temperatures? I also found myself asking the question, what sort of person could do that to another person? Martin Luther King once said that if we do an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, we will be a blind and toothless nation. Jesus said what? Love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. You see, when I read Jesus' words now, I can't help but think of Matthew Shepard's mother. I can't help but think of his mother and of her life that is shaped by a gospel. A gospel that is deeper than hatred, a gospel that is stronger than revenge. And quite honestly, I don't know that I could do what she did. But I hold her in my memory as a witness to the power of the gospel. Such love, well, it's not practical, but it is a love that can change the world. It is a love that can make a difference in the lives of countless people. If we will love our enemies, do good to those who hate us, and seek to do unto others and to treat others the way we would want